Welcome to the war narrative where wars become stories. Today we uncover the dramatic tale of the Franco-Prussian War, a conflict that reshaped Europe. This is the story of how Prussia destroyed France's empire, marking the fall of Napoleon III and the rise of a new German power. In the cold December of 1805, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the height of his genius. At Austerlitz, the Battle of the Three Emperors, his smaller French force outmaneuvered and crushed the combined might of Austria and Russia. The victory was so dazzling that people at the time described it as the sun of Austerlitz, a moment when Europe was blinded by the brilliance of one man's ambition. The Holy Roman Empire crumbled soon after, and Napoleon's France strode across the continent like a giant. Innovations in artillery, infantry tactics, and the speed of movement became the hallmarks of French warfare. For decades afterward, his name remained a shadow that haunted Europe. But history is cruel in its irony. Just 65 years later, France would find itself on the receiving end of the very methods Napoleon had pioneered. The thunder of artillery that once carried French banners to victory would now be mastered by others, by the iron-willed generals of Prussia. At Sedan in 1870, it was Napoleon's nephew, Napoleon III, who watched his empire collapse in mere weeks, undone by forces more disciplined, more modern, and more relentless. The story between these two bookends, Austerlitz and Sedan, is not just the story of battles. It is the tale of how nations rise and fall, how innovations are born in the fire of one generation and perfected by another, and how ambition can drive both glory and ruin. Napoleon I had once said, "God fights on the side with the best artillery." By 1870, that divine favor had shifted to Prussia. The Franco-Prussian War was brief, barely 6 months, but it would redraw the map of Europe, topple an empire, and set the stage for the centuries' coming storms. It was a conflict born not only of armies and generals, but of pride, deception, and the desperate need of two nations to define themselves. For France, it was a chance to cling to imperial grandeur. For Prussia, it was the final test to forge a German empire. And so, we begin our journey from the echoes of Austerlitz to the cannons of Sedan, tracing how one empire fell and another was born in the smoke and fire of 1870. 4 years before the Franco-Prussian War erupted, Europe had already been shaken by another conflict, the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. On the surface, it seemed like a contest between two German powers over influence in the patchwork of German-speaking states. In reality, it was a struggle for supremacy, a fight to determine who would lead the future of Central Europe, the ancient but faltering Habsburg monarchy of Austria, or the lean, modern, and ambitious kingdom of Prussia. Prussia's victory was astonishing in both speed and scale. In just 7 weeks, the Habsburg armies, once considered the guardians of the German world, were broken at Königgrätz. Austria, humiliated, was forced to step aside and give up its centuries-old claim as the head of the German Confederation. Out of this triumph, Otto von Bismarck, the calculating Prussian statesman, forged a new creation, the North German Confederation, founded in 1867 under Prussian leadership. This confederation was not just a loose alliance. It was a blueprint for unity. Prussia now held sway over the Protestant North, binding smaller kingdoms, duchies, and principalities into a common political and military framework. For the first time in centuries, Germans began to imagine themselves as part of one nation rather than scattered fragments divided by local rulers. Bismarck, with his cold pragmatism, had engineered the war deliberately. He knew Austria was a stumbling block to German unity. By excluding it from German affairs, he cleared the path for a new empire, one where Prussia would stand unchallenged. His genius lay not only in diplomacy, but also in timing. He had prepared his country for modern war. Railways allowed Prussia to move troops with speed that stunned its rivals. A reformed general staff led by Helmuth von Moltke drilled in precise maneuvers and lightning coordination. Prussia was not just winning battles. It was rewriting how wars were fought. Europe watched nervously. The sudden rise of a united, militarized Germany alarmed its neighbors, especially France. For centuries, France had been the arbiter of continental power, the nation others measured themselves against. Now to the east, a new power was rising like a storm on the horizon. The French Emperor Napoleon III could not ignore it. He saw in Prussia's rise both a direct challenge to his empire's prestige and a dangerous shift in the delicate balance of Europe. But there was something deeper than politics at play. Across the Rhine, the Germans were beginning to believe in themselves as a people destined for unity and greatness. Across the French border, there was unease, even fear that France's historic dominance was slipping away. It was not yet war, but the ground was trembling. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, known to history as Napoleon III, lived his entire life in the long shadow of his uncle, the great Napoleon I. For many Frenchmen, the name Bonaparte still brought visions of glory, of the son of Austerlitz, of France as master of Europe. Louis Napoleon understood the power of that memory. When he staged his coup d'état in 1851, he deliberately timed it to coincide with the anniversary of Austerlitz as if to cloak himself in his uncle's legacy. A year later, he declared himself Emperor of the French, promising to restore France's prestige and carry forward the Napoleonic name. Yet Louis Napoleon was no military genius. He was a man of politics, charm, and intrigue, but not of battlefield brilliance. His reign relied heavily on symbolism, the Bonapartist legend, to keep the empire's image alive. He knew that to maintain legitimacy, France required victories, or at least the appearance of strength. Without them, his second empire would appear as fragile as glass. For nearly 2 decades, Napoleon III maneuvered to expand France's influence. His army had fought in Crimea, in Italy, even as far afield as Mexico, where a disastrous adventure ended with the execution of France's puppet emperor, Maximilian. Each of these campaigns was meant to prove that France was still a global power, but they drained resources and exposed the cracks in his empire's foundations. By the late 1860s, the emperor was aging, increasingly ill and plagued by gallstones and arthritis that left him hobbling in pain. Yet the pressure to act, to grasp one more triumph, only grew. France's population and economy lagged behind Germany's rising strength, and whispers spread that the Second Empire was losing its vitality. Napoleon's ministers pressed him. France must secure territorial gains along the Rhine to safeguard its eastern frontier. Such demands were not only strategic but symbolic. France could not allow Prussia's star to rise unchecked. This hunger for prestige blinded Napoleon III to the realities of his army. Though still formidable on paper, the French military suffered from systemic flaws. Selective conscription that let the wealthy buy their way out of service, leaving the ranks filled with poor peasants, outdated logistics, and officers more interested in court favor than in reform. The emperor, trapped in his uncle's shadow, could not see these weaknesses clearly. Instead, he clung to the belief that one bold stroke could restore France's glory. But across the Rhine stood a man who understood France's desperation all too well, Otto von Bismarck. And he was already weaving the trap that would bring Napoleon III's empire crashing down. If Napoleon III lived in the shadow of his uncle, Otto von Bismarck lived in the cold light of calculation. He was no soldier in shining armor, no general leading men into battle. He was a statesman who wielded diplomacy like a blade, sharp and merciless. His mission was singular, the unification of Germany under Prussian leadership, and he knew that to achieve it, he would need one more war. The southern German states, Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and Hesse-Darmstadt, still stood apart from Prussia's North German Confederation. Catholic, independent, and wary of Protestant Prussian dominance, they hesitated to join the Union. But Bismarck understood something vital. Nothing unites a people faster than a common enemy. If France could be provoked into a war, then those southern states would have no choice but to rally behind Prussia for their survival. The opportunity came in 1870 with the Spanish throne. A distant cousin of the Prussian king, Prince Leopold of Hohenzollern, was offered the Spanish crown after Queen Isabella II was deposed. To France, the idea was intolerable. Prussia already loomed threateningly across the Rhine. Could they also allow a Hohenzollern on the throne in Madrid? It would mean France was surrounded north and south by Prussian influence. The French court erupted in fury. Napoleon III demanded assurances from King Wilhelm I of Prussia that Leopold would never take the Spanish throne. Wilhelm, a cautious monarch, was willing to soothe tensions and gave polite assurances. But Bismarck saw an opportunity in the brewing crisis. When French envoys pressed Wilhelm at the spa town of Ems, the king responded with dignified restraint. His telegram reporting the meeting was courteous, until Bismarck touched it. With the precision of a surgeon, Bismarck edited the message into what became known as the Ems dispatch. Stripped of nuance, it made it appear as though Wilhelm had insulted France and that France had insulted him in return. When published in newspapers, it lit a fire of outrage on both sides. To the French public, it was an unforgivable slight to national honor. To the Prussians, it was proof that France was bullying their king. It was exactly what Bismarck intended. This, he said with satisfaction, is like pouring a bucket of petrol on a fire. On July 19, 1870, France declared war on Prussia. Crowds in Paris cheered, confident of victory. The southern German states, as Bismarck had predicted, immediately threw their support behind Prussia. The trap had sprung shut. What the French did not realize was that their enemy had already been preparing for this very moment. Prussia's railway, staff planning, and logistical networks were primed for rapid mobilization. The French Empire, proud and loud in its declaration, was marching headlong into the jaws of a war it could not win. When France declared war on Prussia in July 1870, both nations believed they held the advantage. On paper, the French army seemed formidable, one of the best in Europe. It had fought in Crimea, in Italy, and in distant Mexico. Its officers prided themselves on being the heirs of Napoleon I, and its soldiers carried weapons that were the envy of the continent. The most famous of these was the Chassepot rifle, a breech-loading bolt-action weapon introduced in 1866. With its superior range, accuracy, and rate of fire, the Chassepot far outclassed the Prussian Dreyse needle gun, an older design dating back to the 1840s. French soldiers could fire accurately at nearly twice the distance of their Prussian counterparts. And in the opening skirmishes, this edge would prove devastating. The French also deployed the mitrailleuse, a terrifying innovation, a multi-barreled volley gun capable of spitting out 125 rounds per minute. It was one of the earliest forms of rapid-fire weaponry, and its psychological impact alone was enormous. Soldiers who faced its thunder described it as if the very air had been torn apart by steel. If used properly, it had the potential to change battle. But weapons are only as effective as the system that wields them. And here lay France's Achilles heel. The French army was professional but rigid. Its system of selective conscription meant that wealthy men could pay for replacements, leaving the ranks filled largely with poor peasants. Reserves existed, but they were small compared to Prussia's vast manpower. France could field perhaps 400,000 trained soldiers in total. Prussia, by contrast, had pioneered a system of universal conscription with short service. Young men served briefly on active duty, then spent years in reserve, ready to be called up in times of war. This created a massive trained pool, over 1 million men who could be mobilized quickly. The standing Prussian army might have been smaller than France's at the outset, but once mobilization began, it was like a tidal wave. More important than numbers was organization. Since the early 19th century, the Prussians had perfected the institution of the General Staff, a professional corps of officers trained to plan, coordinate, and execute war with scientific precision. Under the command of Helmuth von Moltke, the staff mapped out every river crossing, every rail line, every supply depot in eastern France. German mobilization was not chaos, but clockwork. Trains moved troops with ruthless efficiency, delivering them to the frontier faster than France ever anticipated. Artillery, too, was a realm where the Germans excelled. The French relied on traditional bronze muzzle-loading guns, effective but slow. The Prussians had embraced new steel breech-loading Krupp cannons fitted with modern fuses and capable of astonishing accuracy and rate of fire. These weapons would soon prove decisive, sweeping French positions with relentless barrages. And so the contrast was stark. France possessed excellent rifles and the promise of terrifying new technology, but its leadership, logistics, and reserves were fragile. Prussia's rifles were outdated, but its staff system, artillery, and manpower were modern and overwhelming. Each side convinced itself it would win quickly. Each was certain the war would be short, but only one had truly prepared for what was to come. On July 28, 1870, Emperor Napoleon III left Paris to take command of the Army of the Rhine. He was cheered along the boulevards, hailed as the heir of Austerlitz, who would surely deliver another glorious victory for France. Crowds showered him with flowers, and newspapers proclaimed that the German colossus would crumble before the might of French arms. The emperor himself, frail and racked with pain, leaned heavily in his saddle, but for the public, he wore the mask of confidence. France needed a triumph, however small, to light the flame of national pride. That chance came only a few days later. On August 2nd, French troops crossed the German frontier and attacked the town of Saarbrücken. Scouts reported that it was defended by little more than a regiment of Prussian troops, isolated and vulnerable. Leading the French Second Corps, General Frossard seized the opportunity. His men advanced under the hot summer sun, their chassepot rifles cracking with deadly accuracy as the startled German defenders fell back. The skirmish was brief but dramatic. French infantry stormed the town, driving the Prussians from their positions and planting the tricolor flag atop the heights. For the first time in the war, French soldiers and civilians alike felt the surge of victory. Napoleon III's young son, the Prince Imperial, was even brought to the battlefield to witness the action. A painter captured the moment in romantic brushstrokes, the boy gazing proudly at the soldiers as if France's future had been baptized in fire. Back in Paris, the news was greeted with jubilation. Bells rang and the press declared that the French army had already begun to liberate German soil. The emperor's government spoke of Saarbrücken as though it were the opening chord of another Austerlitz. Yet beneath the surface, the truth was far less triumphant. The action at Saarbrücken was a minor skirmish, a pinprick compared to the battles to come. The Prussian defenders had withdrawn deliberately, falling back on well-prepared lines. And while the French rifles had shown their superiority, their army had gained little of strategic value. In fact, Napoleon's decision to launch the attack revealed his impatience and anxiety. He needed a victory to show his people, no matter how small. Meanwhile, to the east, the German war machine was already grinding into motion. 3 entire armies, assembled with stunning speed thanks to Moltke's railway timetables, were advancing toward the French frontier. Their artillery, their reserves, and their coordination dwarfed anything France could muster. The French rejoiced in their brief triumph at Saarbrücken. But to the Prussians, it was nothing more than the spark before the storm. The real war was only just beginning, and the first hammer blow was about to fall. The illusion of easy victory shattered only days after Saarbrücken. On August 4, 1870, the thunder of war rolled across Alsace as German forces struck the French at the frontier town of Wissembourg. General Abel Douay, commanding barely 8,000 men of the French Fourth Corps, found himself facing an avalanche, nearly 50,000 Bavarian and Prussian troops descending upon his thin line. At dawn, the French held their ground with desperate courage. The chassepot rifles spoke with deadly clarity, cutting down attackers at ranges the old Prussian Dreyse needle gun could not match. Douay's men, though outnumbered, fought fiercely from vineyards, villages, and ridges. But the storm was too great. Artillery fire rained down, collapsing stone walls and scattering defenders. In the chaos, General Douay himself was killed when a shell exploded near an ammunition wagon. Leaderless, his men fell back in disorder as German columns surged forward. By afternoon, the tricolor was torn down over Wissembourg. Civilians waved white flags in terror as Bavarian troops poured through the streets. French soldiers continued to resist from houses and rooftops, sniping at the advancing enemy. But it was hopeless. By nightfall, the town was in German hands, and France's first real taste of battle had ended in bitter defeat. The disaster at Wissembourg was only the beginning. 2 days later, on August 6th, the Germans pressed their advantage at the Battle of Worth. Marshal Patrice de MacMahon, commanding the French First Corps, had hastily drawn up defenses along wooded ridgelines near the town. His 45,000 men were brave and well-armed, their mitrailleuse batteries ready to unleash torrents of fire. But against them marched the German Third Army, 90,000 strong with massed Krupp artillery. The fighting was savage. French volleys tore bloody gaps in the advancing Germans. Yet the relentless bombardment of Krupp cannons forced the French from their strongpoints one by one. Villages caught fire under the shelling and smoke drifted across the fields as cavalry clashed in furious charges. At one point, French cuirassiers, the proud heavy horsemen of Napoleon's legacy, thundered forward with sabers flashing only to be shattered by artillery and rifle fire. Their charge, magnificent yet suicidal, ended with bodies strewn across the fields of Worth. By evening, MacMahon's army was in full retreat, leaving behind thousands of dead and wounded. Nearly 20,000 French casualties lay on the battlefield, while German losses, though heavy, were far smaller. For the first time, it was clear superior French rifles and bravery alone could not overcome the cold precision of German artillery and planning. The defeats at Wissembourg and Worth sent shock waves through France. The proud army of the Rhine, believed invincible only weeks before, was suddenly reeling. Paris was stunned into silence. Napoleon III, frail and uncertain, entrusted more and more to his marshals. Yet even they could not hide the truth. The Germans had seized the initiative, and in the streets of Berlin, Munich, and Stuttgart, the news was greeted with jubilation. The southern German states, once hesitant, now threw themselves fully into the war. What Bismarck had predicted was unfolding. A common enemy was binding Germans together in blood and fire. The war that France had declared with confidence was rapidly slipping from its grasp, and the hammer blows had only just begun. Even as MacMahon's corps staggered, back from the slaughter at Worth, another French army was reeling under the weight of German steel. On the same day, August 6, 1870, the French Second Corps under General Frossard clashed with the Prussians at Spicheren near the city of Saarbrücken. The ground at Spicheren was rugged, steep wooded slopes, ravines, and ridges that gave defenders a natural advantage. Frossard's men, well-positioned and armed with Chassepot rifles, poured devastating fire into the advancing German infantry. At first, it seemed that France might finally hold its ground. The Prussians, struggling uphill under withering fire, fell in heaps. French officers reported with pride how their men's marksmanship was cutting down enemies at distances the Drey's needle gun could not match. But the Germans possessed something France lacked: a system of coordination that turned chaos into momentum. Units advanced not in rigid blocks but in small independent detachments, probing the French line from multiple angles. When French commanders tried to rally for counterattacks, their orders arrived late or garbled. Communications faltered. Generals could not see beyond the smoke and confusion. By contrast, the Prussian staff network hummed with precision, relaying movements and reinforcing pressure points. Then came the artillery. From the ridges behind, German Krupp breech-loading cannons opened fire, their shells bursting with merciless accuracy. The thunder rolled without pause, breaking French formations and sowing terror. Frossard's men clung to their defenses, but every hour brought new German reinforcements across the frontier. By afternoon, the French position was crumbling. Ammunition dwindled, discipline wavered. When German units finally stormed the French positions, the struggle dissolved into brutal close-quarters combat. Villages and farmhouses became fortresses, contested room by room as French soldiers fought desperately to delay the tide. Yet the tide could not be stopped. By evening, the order to withdraw was given. The French army once more fell back in disorder. The twin disasters, Worth in the south and Spicheren in the north, were catastrophic. 2 French corps had been mauled in a single day. Napoleon III, reeling from the news, struggled to maintain control of the campaign. His generals bickered, unsure of whether to stand and fight again or retreat deeper into France. The emperor himself, pale and suffering, seemed increasingly unable to command. Across the Rhine, jubilation surged. German newspapers proclaimed the victories as proof of divine favor.
In Prussia, Bells rang in Celebration.
The southern states, already drawn into the conflict, now sent their armies forward with renewed zeal. The war was becoming what Bismarck had always intended, a German war of unity, fought not just under Prussia's banner, but for a nation that was being born on the battlefield. For France, the illusion of a short, glorious war was over. The storm had broken and its armies were staggering before the gale. Ahead lay Metz and beyond that Sedan. The defeats at Worth and Spicheren were more than battlefield losses. They were blows to the very heart of France's confidence. The aura of Napoleonic invincibility, so carefully cultivated by Napoleon III, was gone in a matter of days. Panic rippled through the ranks and the Grand Army of the Rhine found itself stumbling backward toward the fortress city of Metz, pursued relentlessly by German armies that seemed to move with mechanical precision. Napoleon III, weakened by illness and indecision, yielded operational command to Marshal François-Achille Bazaine, a man known more for caution than for boldness. Bazaine was brave in his way, but he lacked the fiery instincts of a Napoleon. His hesitation would soon prove fatal. Instead of retreating swiftly to regroup with other French forces, Bazaine lingered, arguing with his staff, second-guessing reports, and wasting precious days. Each hour lost allowed Moltke's German armies to close the trap. The first major clash of this retreat came on August 16, 1870 at the village of Mars-la-Tour. Here, a mere 30,000 Prussians blundered into nearly 120,000 French soldiers. By every rule of war, the Germans should have been annihilated. Yet, the Prussian officers did not retreat. They attacked. Cavalry brigades charged with reckless valor, hurling themselves against French artillery positions in what later generations would call the death ride. Entire regiments were cut to pieces, but their sacrifice bought time, stalling the French advance and confusing Bazaine's command. The result was shocking. Instead of pressing his overwhelming advantage, Bazaine hesitated, convinced that he faced far greater numbers than he actually did. By the end of the day, the French had failed to break through. The road west, France's lifeline of retreat, remained in German hands. 2 days later, on August 18th, the armies clashed again at Grave-la-Teste, Privat in what became the largest battle of the war. Nearly 190,000 Germans and 140,000 Frenchmen collided in a storm of fire. The French chassepot rifles and mitrailleuses tore bloody holes in the German ranks, repelling charge after charge with devastating volleys. But once again, German Krupp artillery tipped the balance. More than 200 cannons roared, smashing French positions, setting villages ablaze and sowing panic. The Imperial Guard, France's proud elite, was thrown into the fight to stabilize the line. But as they advanced, they saw their allies already in retreat. General Bourbaki, furious, is said to have cried, "You promised me victory, and now you deliver me a rout." Morale collapsed. The French army broke and streamed back into Metz, bloodied and demoralized. The losses were staggering: 20,000 French casualties, 20,000 Germans. Yet the outcome was clear. France had been driven back into the fortress, and Moltke had achieved his goal. Metz was now surrounded. Inside its walls were over 180,000 French troops, effectively trapped and cut off from the rest of the war. In Paris, shock turned to despair. What had begun with cheers and songs of victory was fast becoming a national nightmare. The emperor's indecision, Bazaine's hesitation, and the ruthless efficiency of the German machine had combined to deliver France's armies into a cage. And as Bazaine's men starved behind the walls of Metz, the German armies turned their gaze westward. Another French force was gathering under Marshal MacMahon. Moltke and Bismarck now prepared the final snare, one that would close around France's emperor himself. By late August 1870, the French Empire was already reeling. At Metz, Bazaine's 180,000 men were locked inside the fortress, slowly being strangled by the tightening noose of German siege lines. In Paris, the mood turned grim, and in the emperor's own tent, the man who had once promised to revive the glory of the Bonaparte name struggled even to stand upright. Napoleon III was ill, gravely so. Years of gallstones and advanced arthritis had left him bent, pale and racked with pain. He often needed to be helped into the saddle. His face twisted in agony as he tried to project the air of a commander. Officers whispered of his weakness. Soldiers could see their emperor hobbling through the camps. The shadow of Napoleon I had never felt so heavy. Where his uncle had been a titan of war, The nephew was a faltering, broken man, scarcely able to ride with his troops. In many ways, the state of Napoleon's health mirrored that of his army. France's military system, once envied across Europe, was rotting from within. Its selective conscription allowed any man with money to buy his way out of service, leaving the ranks filled with poor peasants and day laborers, many of them illiterate. These men, though often brave, were poorly prepared for modern warfare. The officer corps fared little better, plagued by favoritism, inefficiency, and in too many cases, rampant alcoholism. Promotions were often rewards for loyalty to the regime rather than military talent. The result was an army that looked splendid on parade but cracked under the weight of war. French artillery, once the pride of Napoleon, now lagged behind its German counterpart. The vaunted mitrailleuse, so terrifying in theory, was misused, scattered piecemeal instead of concentrated for decisive effect. Logistics faltered. Supply lines broke down. Soldiers went hungry while wagons clogged the roads in endless confusion. And yet, despite everything, France could not stop. With Bazeilles bottled up in Metz, the only hope lay with Marshal Patrice de MacMahon, who commanded another large force farther west. He was ordered to march north, relieve Metz, and somehow turn the tide of war. But it was a desperate gamble. MacMahon's army was exhausted. 120,000 men trudging through heat and dust, their boots worn, their spirits low. Many were raw recruits, hastily conscripted and poorly trained, thrust into ranks beside veterans. Napoleon III rode with them, a ghost of his former self. Observers described him as melancholy, almost resigned, as though he sensed the storm gathering around him. Perhaps deep down he already knew the truth. The empire his uncle had built in fire and triumph was about to collapse in ruin. The German armies, swift and relentless, were already moving to intercept. Cavalry patrols shadowed MacMahon's march, reporting his every move to Moltke's general staff. The Prussian chief, calm and meticulous, saw the opportunity, forming a trap that could destroy not just another French army, but the emperor himself. The French soldiers muttered as they marched, "We are being led into a chamber pot, and soon enough someone will sit on it." Their dark humor was not wrong. Sedan, the place of destiny, was already waiting. The French high command, gripped by desperation, placed all its hopes on a single move. Marshal MacMahon was ordered to march northward to relieve Bazeilles at Metz. If successful, this move could free 180,000 trapped French soldiers and give the Second Empire a chance to recover. But the march was reckless, driven more by political pressure from Paris than by sound military logic. MacMahon's army, roughly 120,000 men, was exhausted before it even began. They trudged through dust and heat, worn boots cutting into blistered feet, their ranks swollen with hastily conscripted recruits who barely knew their drills. Veterans marched with grim resignation, sensing the futility of their orders. Officers quarreled over routes, supplies lagged behind, and the army stretched into a straggling column, vulnerable to attack. Napoleon III accompanied them, but he was a ghostly presence. Suffering from gallstones and arthritis, he rode in agony, sometimes slumping in his carriage, unable to project strength. The emperor had become a liability, an object of pity rather than inspiration. Soldiers whispered of his frailty. One officer later remarked, "It was as though France itself was sick and we were following our emperor into decline." Meanwhile, the Germans watched every step. Their cavalry patrols, the eyes of Moltke's army, trailed MacMahon's column relentlessly, reporting movements back to headquarters with near-perfect efficiency. Thanks to their network of railways and detailed maps, the Germans could shadow the French and predict their path with chilling accuracy. Moltke quickly recognized the opportunity. By driving his armies along converging routes, he could trap MacMahon against the Belgian frontier. The plan was daring but precise. 3 German armies would converge like the jaws of a great machine closing in from east, north, and west. By late August, MacMahon realized the danger too late. His army was being funneled toward the town of Sedan, a sleepy fortress city nestled in a bend of the river Meuse. The surrounding hills and forests formed a natural basin, easy to defend but even easier to surround. To one despairing officer, the terrain looked like a deadly trap. He famously muttered, "We are in a chamber pot, and soon someone will sit on it." The French tried to hurry their march, but the Germans were faster. Bavarian and Prussian columns pushed relentlessly, tightening the noose. Every attempt at diversion or retreat was spotted and countered. The French soldiers, hungry and weary, dug in around Sedan with little understanding of the storm that was about to break. On the last day of August, as German troops closed from all sides, MacMahon's army prepared to fight. The emperor remained with his men, pale and unsteady, clinging to a dignity that war was fast stripping away. Behind him lay the shattered hopes of the Second Empire. Before him stood the cold precision of the Prussian war machine. The jaws of Moltke's trap had closed. Sedan would be the test, the battle that would decide not only the fate of an army, but of an empire. The dawn of September 1st, 1870 broke under a shroud of mist over the valleys and hills surrounding Sedan. Within that mist lay the battered army of MacMahon's exhausted men arrayed in makeshift positions. Their lines stretched across villages, ridges, and the wooded slopes north of the town. Many soldiers had marched through the night. Some had no breakfast, only black coffee or dry bread. Yet they knew this day would decide their fate. At first light, the Germans struck. The village of Bazeilles, lying just south of Sedan, became the scene of savage fighting. Bavarian troops surged into the streets only to be met by a storm of fire from French Marines and hastily armed civilians. From windows, doorways, and even church steeples, defenders rained chassepot bullets upon their attackers. The Bavarians, taken aback, were forced into brutal house-to-house combat. Entire blocks were set ablaze by artillery shells. Women and children fled through smoke-filled streets while Marines fought with bayonets and rifle butts, refusing to yield. For hours, Bazeilles burned and bled. The French defense became legendary, later immortalized as the last cartridges, when a handful of Marines trapped in a house continued to fire until their ammunition was gone. But bravery could not stop numbers. By noon, the Bavarians had taken the village at a terrible cost, nearly 4,000 casualties, and the southern flank of Sedan lay exposed. Elsewhere, the German encirclement tightened. Artillery, massed in overwhelming numbers, began hammering French positions from the surrounding heights. Over 400 Krupp guns thundered in coordinated salvos, their shells bursting with relentless precision. French soldiers clung to cover as earth and stone exploded around them. Their own artillery, outdated bronze muzzle-loaders, fired bravely but too slowly, too inaccurately to silence the German barrage. Marshal MacMahon rode among his troops, rallying them with desperate energy. Then disaster struck. A shell fragment tore into his body, leaving him gravely wounded. Carried from the field, he was forced to surrender command at the very moment his army needed unity most. What followed was chaos. One general ordered retreat, another countermanded it, and still others claimed authority from Paris itself. The French high command splintered in the midst of battle, each voice contradicting the next. Napoleon III was present but powerless. He moved about the field in his carriage, racked with pain, attempting to show himself to the men. Some soldiers cheered faintly at the sight of their emperor. Others looked away in silence, sensing only the despair etched into his face. It was clear he was not the man of Austerlitz but a broken ruler presiding over disaster. By midday the Germans had seized the crossings of the Meuse to the west while Bavarian troops pressed from the south and Prussian divisions closed from the north. The French were being funneled, slowly and inexorably, back toward Sedan itself. What had begun as a battle was turning into a trap. Inside the tightening ring, French soldiers fought bravely, but the noose drew ever tighter. By afternoon, Sedan was no longer just a battlefield. It was a cage, and the French army, once the pride of Europe, was the animal trapped within. By the afternoon of September 1st, 1870, Sedan had become hell on earth. Surrounded on all sides, the French army of Chalons was trapped in a basin with the river Meuse and the town's old 17th-century fortifications at their backs. The Germans, perched on the surrounding high ground, poured destruction down into the cauldron. Over 400 Krupp guns opened fire in relentless unison. Their shells screamed through the sky, bursting among French ranks, collapsing houses and turning fields into smoking craters. Soldiers huddled in ditches or crouched behind stone walls as entire companies were ripped apart in moments. Officers who tried to rally their men found their voices drowned by the thunder of artillery. For many Frenchmen, it felt less like a battle than an execution. Yet, amidst the carnage, courage flickered. The proud French cavalry, the last echo of Napoleonic grandeur, launched a series of desperate charges to break the encirclement. Cuirassiers in gleaming breastplates and plumed helmets galloped forward, sabers raised, riding into sheets of rifle and cannon fire. One observer wrote that they charged as if death itself could be outrun. Time and again they hurled themselves at the German lines, and time and again they were shattered. Horses tumbling, riders cut down, banners falling into the mud. King Wilhelm of Prussia, watching from the heights, is said to have murmured in awe, "Ah, those brave men!" Even their enemies recognized the suicidal valor of the French horsemen. But bravery could not overcome artillery. The charges ended in heaps of broken men and beasts, sacrifices swallowed by the smoke of Krupp cannons. Meanwhile, Napoleon III moved listlessly among his troops, pale and broken. Some soldiers cheered faintly, but many more saw in him not a savior, but a man already resigned to defeat. He rode forward at times as though courting death, hoping perhaps that a shell might end his misery. Fate denied him even that. As the afternoon waned, the French army disintegrated. Regiments fought in isolation, unaware of their neighbors' fate, cut off by the chaos of bombardment. The village of Bazeilles lay in ruins, its defenders dead or captured. On every side, German infantry pressed closer, bayonets glinting through the smoke. By late day, the French were hemmed in behind Sedan's walls, a mass of shattered units, civilians, and the wounded all crammed together under the ceaseless rain of shells. At around 5 o'clock in the evening, Napoleon III accepted the inevitable. A white flag rose above Sedan's citadel, fluttering weakly in the smoke-filled sky. The emperor had surrendered not only himself, but nearly 83,000 men of his army. Of the 124,000 who had begun the battle, 17,000 lay dead or wounded, and another 21,000 had been taken prisoner during the fighting. Barely a handful escaped across the border into Belgium. The fate of France's Second Empire had been sealed in a single day. What Napoleon I had built with fire and iron, his nephew had lost in smoke and ruin. Sedan was not merely a defeat. It was destruction. When the smoke cleared at Sedan, the scale of the disaster staggered Europe. Never before had France suffered such a total collapse on its own soil. An entire imperial army, over 83,000 men, surrendered with their emperor. The proud tricolor, once planted from Madrid to Moscow, now drooped in humiliation. For Napoleon III, there was no escape. On the morning after the battle, he was escorted to King Wilhelm of Prussia. Dressed not as a conqueror, but as a prisoner, the French emperor presented his sword. His words were heavy with defeat. "Having been unable to die in the midst of my troops, there remains nothing for me but to place my sword in your Majesty's hands." Wilhelm accepted it solemnly. Bismarck, always practical, noted simply, "The emperor has fallen, and with him, France." Back in Paris, the news spread like wildfire. Crowds gathered in anger, not grief. Napoleon III, once hailed as the heir of Austerlitz, was now scorned as the author of disaster. His empire, built on the illusion of Bonapartist glory, crumbled overnight. On September 4, 1870, mobs stormed the legislative halls and proclaimed the birth of the Third Republic. The Empress Eugenie, who had been serving as regent in her husband's absence, fled into exile. The Second Empire was dead. Yet, though the emperor had been captured, the war was not over. The new republic vowed to continue the fight even as its armies lay shattered. "Not an inch of our soil, not a stone of our fortresses," declared Leon Gambetta, one of the republic's fiery leaders. But patriotic defiance could not disguise the grim reality. France's military was in ruins, and its enemy was marching inexorably toward Paris. The psychological shock of Sedan was immense. For the Germans, it was triumph, proof of their unity, discipline, and strength. For France, it was humiliation on a scale unseen since Agincourt. Sedan became more than a battle. It became a scar, a national trauma that would fester for decades. Children in French schools would be taught to remember it as the day their nation was betrayed by incompetence and misfortune. In Germany, it was celebrated as the birthpang of empire. On that September day, the fate of nations shifted. The Bonapartist dream was shattered. The French Empire had fallen, not with a blaze of glory, but with a white flag raised over a ruined fortress. And above the fields of Sedan, the thunder of Prussian cannons still echoed, heralding the dawn of a new power in Europe. With Napoleon III a prisoner and the Second Empire collapsed, France found itself adrift. The new Third Republic, proclaimed in Paris on September 4, 1870, vowed defiantly to continue the fight. But the war had already slipped beyond salvation. The German armies, seasoned and organized, pressed forward inexorably toward the French capital. By mid-September, Prussian, Bavarian, and Saxon divisions converged around Paris. On September 19th, the great city was surrounded. From that moment, Paris became a besieged island in a sea of German steel. Within its walls were nearly 2 million civilians, a national guard swollen with political radicals and shopkeepers, and only about 60,000 real soldiers. Supplies dwindled quickly. The city endured hunger, cold, and disease. Famously, Parisians resorted to eating horses, dogs, cats, and even zoo animals to survive. Each week brought new rumors of relief, but none came. Meanwhile, the fate of Metz was sealed. Marshal Bazeilles, still trapped with his 180,000 men, resisted in hope of rescue. But on October 27th, starvation forced him to surrender. It was one of the largest surrenders in European history. With Metz gone, the Germans were free to tighten the noose around Paris. Yet Paris refused to yield easily. In November, the French managed one moment of triumph at Coulmiers. A hastily assembled army of the Loire surprised and defeated a Bavarian corps, liberating Orleans. For a brief moment, hope flickered, but it was a false dawn. The Germans counterattacked swiftly, retook Orleans, and forced the Loire army into retreat. Paris remained isolated. Inside the capital, desperation mingled with defiance. Balloons were launched over German lines to carry messages, and Gambetta himself escaped the city in a balloon to rally resistance from the provinces. But each sortie, each attempt to break the siege was beaten back by German artillery and discipline. The once mighty French army had been reduced to fragments, scattered and leaderless. On January 18, 1871, while Paris still starved, the Germans staged their greatest triumph. In the glittering Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, King Wilhelm of Prussia was proclaimed Kaiser Wilhelm I of a united German Empire. The symbolism was deliberate and cruel. The new empire born in the heart of France in the palace of Louis XIV. German officers cheered and Bismarck smiled grimly. The dream of German unity had been realized, forged in French defeat. 10 days later, after weeks of bombardment that reduced districts of Paris to rubble, the city surrendered. On January 28th, an armistice was signed. France laid down its arms. The war was over. The peace was harsh. By the Treaty of Frankfurt, signed in May 1871, France was forced to cede Alsace and Lorraine to the new German Empire, a wound that would fester in the French soul for generations. A crushing indemnity was imposed. German troops marched in victory parades, while in France bitterness boiled. But the bloodshed was not finished. In March, radicals in Paris rose up against the new Republican government, declaring the Paris Commune. For 2 months, the city became a revolutionary state until government troops stormed it in May, unleashing the Bloody Week massacre that left tens of thousands dead. For Germany, the war was the foundation stone of empire. For France, it was humiliation, trauma, and the beginning of a restless desire for revenge. Sedan became a symbol of betrayal. Alsace-Lorraine, a cry for justice. These wounds would not heal easily. They would fester, and 40 years later, they would explode again in the trenches of the First World War. The Franco-Prussian War lasted only 6 months, but its echoes would shape Europe for decades. It destroyed one empire, created another, and planted the seeds of future catastrophe. History had turned with fire and steel on the fields of Sedan and under the walls of Paris.